kind of social policy that councils have, and while it probably doesn't do all the things because of the legislative framework that sits around it that you'd like to do in this space, it's certainly one of the tools that can help you go forward. And we'll be discussing the kind of parameters of that today, but there may be some opportunities to also discuss things that sit sort of outside the legislative framework for the policy, but that you as a council wish to progress anyway. So look, we'll just go through some high-level information that's available to give you a bit of perspective. But as I said to the chair, I'm really keen for this to be a conversation and not just a one-way, me giving you a whole lot of information, but for you to ask questions as we go. Feel free to. As Greg said and JP said, I've now been, this is the third of your gambling policies I've supported you through in terms of review, so there's some knowledge going back almost 10 years in terms of understanding some of the background to that. So look, in terms of a high-level perspective, basically the Gambling Act that came in 2002 has had an effect of a gradual decline in gaming machines and venues since 2002. It's probably not what the legislators at the time really wanted to achieve. I think they wanted to achieve something far more dramatic and quick, but the way the legislation set out doesn't really enable that to be achieved perhaps as quickly as everyone wanted. In terms of the kind of key point around gambling and the issues with gambling is that although we have a range of ways in which we can participate in gambling, electronic gaming machines, or pokies as they're more colloquially known, are the most kind of risky type of gambling for those that wish to participate in that. The largest portion of the population buy lottery products, but don't do it very often, and the way lottery products work is they don't have that same kind of addictive nature that electronic gaming machines do. So there's a very small portion of the population who gamble on electronic gambling machines or pokies, but they spend the most, and they're typically also the most vulnerable and at-risk parts of our population. So that's why this Act and this legislation does have a real focus on electronic gaming machines. Next one. Oh, thanks. As I said, Class 4 gambling machines are the primary mode of gambling for nearly 50% of people who are treated with gambling problems. So if you have an addiction, you have a gambling problem, it's very likely that that is associated with pokies or electronic gaming machines, and those that treat people with gambling problems see that trend or that connection really clearly in terms of the work that they do. Part of the problem, as I said, is that electronic gaming machines, poker machines, are highly addictive. So the issue there is you can rapidly reinvest the money that you win. So if you have a winning, you get essentially addicted to it quite fast, then you reinvest your money, and essentially that addiction just grows. Māori who live in high deprivation areas are the most impacted by this sort of gambling. And as I said earlier, the small proportion of people that use or gamble on pokies are the ones that are treated essentially the most in terms of their gambling problems. Next one. However, with each of the forms of gambling, there is a community benefit, and our gambling legislation and the way in which we've kind of established this, going back to prior to 2002, is that the government really wanted to make sure that if we do have this form or these forms of gambling, that they do also have a community benefit. So they're set up in that way that there is a community benefit associated with each of the forms of gambling. So the 2.4 billion spent by gamblers, 655 million, or around 31%, is distributed for community purposes. There's a range of different kind of categories and the way in which they allocate that money back, but basically the non-casino trusts, of which there are a number in Rotorua, and around the country raise an estimated $260 million, which is distributed back to the community. The New Zealand Lotteries transferred $201 million through Lottery Grants Board, and the New Zealand Racing Board allocates essentially all of their community funding through to racing clubs. And then casinos also have a range of community trusts through which they distribute that benefit as well. So one of the issues for councils is that you actually have no control over where the Class 4 gambling community benefit is essentially allocated. And there's no obligation on the part of the trusts to return a specific portion of those gaming proceeds to the district where it was produced. So in other words, particularly in Rotorua, where most of the trusts operate nationally or operate outside Rotorua, quite a lot of the funding is distributed outside of Rotorua, and essentially not all of it is distributed back. And that's something that we can talk about that sits sort of outside the policy, but it might be something that you wish to have a bit more of a think about, and we can discuss perhaps ways in which you might influence a change or shift in that. Recognising, of course, that the benefit back to the community is balanced, or you've got to balance that also with the risk and the harm that's caused the community as well. So some of the data, particularly the national data that is available, is now getting quite old, and that's just a feature perhaps of the way in which the research has been undertaken, or perhaps hasn't been funded as in the way it should be. So we're starting to get quite old information about the effects, particularly the benefits to the community, and that might be again something where we can have a discussion about a policy point of where there might be an opportunity to improve some of that. But basically, the kind of information available is that there was a survey in 2009 that estimated there were 300 FTEs directly employed by Class 4 societies or pokie gambling. That might have changed since then, but those were the figures at the time. So it's a relatively low FTE portion. An Australian 2010 report concluded that the economic activity from gambling does not result in significant benefits because essentially there's alternatives to consumer spending. So if you weren't spending that money on gambling, you'd be spending it as a consumer on something else. So this idea that by spending money on gambling is essentially a benefit, that study or that report suggested, well, you as a consumer would just spend it somewhere else, and there isn't really that benefit or not as clear. The same came through an NZIER analysis that essentially found that pokie gambling diverts spending away from other retailers, and often in more vulnerable or more deprived communities, that can be a choice that people are making between putting food on the table and their addiction to gambling. So that is, that benefit, again, sort of a reasonable question mark over whether in fact there's a benefit there as strongly as perhaps the gambling industry indicates. And then at the end of the day, there is the fact that people pay money to gamble, and that suggests there is some entertainment value. And that might be an entertainment value that exists at one level, but then again, I think the risk of addiction and the risk of taking that too far and perhaps spending money that should be spent on something else needs to be kind of balanced up in terms of what that entertainment value is. It sounds like it's both. Okay. So just some local information. So the other part of the policy, as Greg pointed out, is to do with TABs as well. So there's sort of two parts of the policy that you manage that you also need to reflect on and have some local information around. So there's one TAB or board venue at Rotorua Street. Yeah, so that's one in the city, which is overall probably a good thing. You probably wouldn't want more than that. So that at this stage has been there. It's quite stable. It's been there for a very long time, and the policy that manages that part of the gambling issue kind of regulates where that is. So although the Racing Industry Act requires councils to have a policy on TAB venues, you don't have any power to regulate a TAB agency venue or the kind of self-service betting terminals. So it regulates this one TAB venue in the Rotorua, but there's a number of other TAB agency venues, typically in taverns, and self-service betting terminals. They're in taverns as well. You can't manage those. So the legislation just simply doesn't allow you to do that. But again, in terms of the full picture of what is taking place in terms of the provision of gambling services in Rotorua, it's important to kind of understand that those are available as well. And of course, we're also getting into a situation, or have been for some time, where TAB gambling in particular is easily accessed over the internet. And you've probably seen some national debate and discussion too about where New Zealand might go in terms of regulating or deregulating online gambling too. So there's a poise, I think, for a change that's probably in line sometime this or next year on that as well, and that may have an influence over how some of these other gambling activities take place. So there's 24 Class 4 gambling venues in the Rotorua, and that represents 2.3% of venues nationally. Now that's important because essentially Rotorua has more of these venues per population than the rest of the country. So you're a bit of an outlier in terms of that kind of population perspective. So they're licensed to have 362 Class 4 machines, or 2.52% of machines nationally, but as the slide says, Rotorua only makes up 1.5% of the national population. Okay, so essentially you've got more machines per head of population than the population generally. There are 3 club venues with 37 machines, or a total of 354 machines in operation. If you had the national average, so if we kind of looked at those numbers in terms of national average, that would drop down to 247 machines. Okay, so it's quite a significant drop in terms of where you are at the moment. As I said earlier, one of the issues, though, is the legislative framework that this policy sits within is relatively restrictive on what you can do to shift from where you are now to where perhaps you'd like to be. And while it's gradually reduced venues and machines over the past 10 years, and it particularly did at the initial period, that's kind of become a plateau. So we've not seen much change, and the policy is probably not having much more effect than what it could have, and it's probably doing everything that is possible within the legislative framework. And it might be an opportunity to kind of reflect on what else can we do that will sit outside the legislative framework that might have an influence on the number of machines and the number of venues. The expenditure figures, so the gamblers' losses of these Class 4 gambling machines increased to 25.3 million in 2019, and then up again to 26.7 million 2023. But there was this downturn in 2020 and 2021, likely because of COVID. So there's some issues around what happened in that period, but my kind of sense of things, and it sort of appears that these figures have reoccurred nationally, is that we had this kind of effect that was going on in that period. So turning to community grants, so this, as I said earlier, maybe something that you do wish to look at in terms of taking some opportunities that sit outside the policy, but may have some benefit overall to Rotorua. So as I said earlier, 40% of the gaming machine profits or proceeds must be distributed for authorised purposes, but there's no requirement for these to be distributed back essentially to the district from where those proceeds originated. About For Rotorua, you're looking at those sort of figures in 2023 is around 31.9%. So far short of that 40% figure if all those proceeds came back to Rotorua. So question of, are there some things that could be done perhaps to increase that 31.9% and get closer to the 40% return? The way this works, just to give you a little bit of understanding of this, is that a number of the trusts that operate nationally, and they fund essentially national activities or activities that you might see as being national. So a number of kind of national or just sub-national sports teams, so they're distributing funds kind of across the country to do that, or other activities that might benefit from that also kind of operate nationally, so arts and those sorts of things too that take place kind of at a national level. So there is a bit of a sense of, some of that, the proceeds from Rotorua might be distributed to a national organisation that then might hold an event once a year or once every 2 years back in Rotorua, or may not, but there's a little bit of sense that perhaps it is legitimate to have a certain percentage of the proceeds used nationally. But certainly in terms of 31.9%, I think, as I said earlier, there's some opportunities to probably look at ways of increasing that or asking questions about it.
Just, I think it's pertinent as you look along that bottom line, councillors, that the number there that gets closer towards $17 or $18 million in shortfall if you were to look at the 40% that could be reallocated back into our community. And the reason why I'm just pausing there is this morning we just signed off our annual grants to a number of community groups for $195,000 per annum. So you can see the scale of difference in how we're such a minor player in providing that kind of community assistance, which in this graph, this table, shows how far short our community is of actually getting back some of those opportunities for funding.
So just turning now to some analysis of the social costs of gambling. Again, some of the data on which this is based is getting a little dated, but essentially the understanding we have at the moment is the number of problem gamblers. So these are people with reasonably serious gambling issues and problems, estimated to be 459 to 918 people. Those individuals then affect a much wider group of people. So their whānau, other people that they associate with, perhaps their employers. So there's a kind of ripple effect that happens with those people in terms of how gambling then has a wider social cost. As I said, sort of, or alluded to earlier, gambling can lead to neglect, broken homes, damaged relationships, particularly between children and parents. Gambling harm affects some sections of your community more than others, particularly those living in high deprivation neighbourhoods and Māori and Pacific peoples. So there is a social cost that's been a burden of people already, in a sense, experiencing a social cost. So 71% of the EGMs are in the poorest areas of Rotorua. So there is again an association of these machines are located and have been traditionally located in areas where there are higher deprivation neighbourhoods, because those are the customers that tend to gamble on these machines. And there has been some, so your policy has some arrangements to certainly in terms of relocations, only have relocations out of those areas essentially into the CBD, so there is a policy to try and achieve a balancing of that. But as I've said earlier, because we've sort of plateaued in terms of that policy and the reach that it has, there may be some other things that we need to do outside the policy or think about that might address some of those issues. And because, again, of your demographic profile, and again because of the kind of population statistics in comparison to the number of machines, you are, as a district, at greater risk in terms of the impacts of problem gambling than perhaps other districts in Rotorua. There was a really good survey that I was involved in assisting the council at that time with kind of formulating the framework of it, and then we referred to it again at the last review. Essentially, a survey was done in 2017 of the population through APR consultants to kind of gauge the opinions and the way in which people were gambling and what their views were of gambling, and especially pokie gambling back in that period. I've suggested that it may be appropriate for you to repeat the survey over the next 2 or 3 years and prior to the next review. So rather than having the survey, I think, being developed too close to the next review, and certainly I think we've probably would benefit from doing it in the next 3 years rather than trying to do it now. I think it would be a good thing to do, to just set aside in your kind of annual planning process a budget just to undertake that review in the next 3 years, so you can receive that information back in a kind of reasonable fashion, have a bit of a sense of what it's saying, and then you might indicate that there are some things that could be looked at more closely in the next review. So I'm essentially suggesting that would be a good thing to do at some point over the next 1 to 2, 3 years. But what that review back in 2016-17 said is that of the participants or respondents, 78.4% indicated they had undertaken some form of gambling in that sort of prior 6-month period. Kind of lining up with the national statistics, the most popular was a lotto-type gambling activity, entering a competition or raffle ticket. It might be run by a sports club or somewhat of that nature, buying a scratch ticket, and only 8.1%. So really low percentage of those respondents had played a pokie machine outside a casino, so at a pub or a club. So that again just reinforces that concern that a very, very small portion of the population are involved in pokie gambling, yet when you look at the proceeds that come from it, quite a significant part of the proceeds overall come from pokie gambling. The average spend was $435 at that period, with a minimum of $1, but the highest was $20,000, or nearly $21,000. That's a lot of money for someone to have spent on pokie machines. So again, just some kind of concern there with some of that information that came back. I think there's the next slide. Again, reinforcing that national set of statistics, most money was spent while playing pokie machines, despite this being the 6th highest popular gambling activity. Of the 8.1%, or those 40 respondents, the average visits in the 6-month period was 31. So that's a lot of repeat visits to the gambling machines. That kind of average spend per visit of just over $40, and the average spend kind of across that 6 months have been nearly $1,500, and a total of $56,000. So we again, digging into those statistics, digging into who these 8.1% of the population are, and how, in a way, how addicted they've become to this form of gambling, is really just kind of came out of this survey reasonably strongly. We then, in terms of that survey, also looked at the question of what impacts we're having by that problem gambler on their whānau, on their wider set of relationships, and again, just reflecting that kind of national information. Not being able to pay bills was an issue, affecting relationships within whānau, wasting money, losing savings, and even going bankrupt. So there's quite a kind of strong correlation between that survey and the national data. And again, I think it would be worth doing that survey again, but probably look to it over the next 2 to 3 years. The feedback around that kind of period and the previous sort of reviews that we've done, is to essentially look at the two kind of key policy options that you have. So the policy options are really around capping the number of machines or having a sinking lid. So allow, as machines disappear out of the district, perhaps through venues closing and so on, allowing that just to sink over time. And then also there's a key policy option around relocation, so allowing machines to relocate from one venue to another, or from a venue that's perhaps closing down and wanting to re-establish somewhere else. There's sort of questions about whether the relocation policy that you have is as strong as it possibly could be. It does allow relocations with some restrictions and limitations on it. Going to a no relocations policy at all has some difficulties in terms of the way in which the industry respond to that. It locks them, they feel, too closely or too tightly into the kind of requirements. So there's a bit of a balance with either a no relocations policy or a relocations policy within certain restrictions being the right option to go forward. But one of the key things, so currently you've got a policy that allows relocations but has a number of restrictions on where the venues poker machines can relocate to. Around or being close to schools, there are restrictions on that, and there was strong feedback that was appropriate. Again, just that reflection that the gambling societies and venue operators wanted some relocation ability, but were generally accepting that definitely they wouldn't be relocating close to schools. And at that time, Destination Rotorua Board also made quite a strong statement that there was a minimal support from their perspective on the proliferation of venues and poker machines. So it wasn't something they saw as being an attractor of tourism, or that tourists would be attracted to play on these machines. So they were quite comfortable with the policy, and perhaps even moving a little bit more strongly than what the policy currently said. Back to you, or am I? Last one. Okay. So as I said, look, there are limited powers to regulate the number and location of venues and gambling machines, and that's just the legislative framework that you work within. Essentially, you can opt to have a cap on the numbers of machines or apply a sinking lid, and you can also regulate relocations and mergers. So following this kind of initial review and the review that we've been looking at, you've got a cap on the current machines, and you've still got more machines above that. So going to an option of a sinking lid doesn't really make a difference. It's only when you get to basically having the same amount of machines as the cap operates at, that you might either decide then to go, right, let's go to a sinking lid policy and allow it to sink below that, or let's re-establish the cap at a lower level. So at this current point, there isn't much advantage, if any advantage, in re-establishing the cap level or going to a sinking lid, because you've still got more machines above that. But at some point, and it might be that at the next review, we're getting, things have changed, and there may be a position there where it's useful to adopt either a lower cap or go to a sinking lid. There's a statutory requirement on the number of machines in the venues. There is this relocation that's allowed, but you've tightened up and got stronger restrictions on those, and probably have got to a point where those restrictions are doing as much as they can. And there's also conditions about the venues, and particularly where the TAB venue is. So my kind of overall, I'm hoping I'm not jumping into your, but my overall kind of sense of things is your policy is doing pretty much everything it could. Yes, there are some tweaks that you could make to that, but in making those tweaks, you've got to then go through a special consultation procedure, and then quite a lot of effort in terms of stakeholder engagement for that, and then the public input on that as well. And the question is, would you benefit from doing that or without some strong policy change that you're recommending, it may be that the public feedback is that they'd like you to do a lot more, but in fact your hands are tied. So you might get yourself in a situation where you're consulting with the community asking you to do a lot more, but you're not really going to be in a position to be able to. So that's kind of, in a sense, I think your policy is about right. As I said, you could make some tweaks to that, but I think the downside is that in consulting with the community, you're probably going to get some feedback from the community that they'd like you to do far more, and that your hands will be tied, and you need to explain carefully that position. So the option is that you're required legislatively to do the review. You've done that. That's the process that myself and Greg and JP have been going through, and now we've brought to your workshop. You can simply keep the policy as is, and then look to some other options, some other things that you could do that sit outside the policy, such as perhaps doing the survey again, and we can talk about some of those options as well. But my recommendation would be to complete the review and then essentially have recommendations through to the appropriate committee and council that the policy should remain as is, and it's doing as much as we can. But I think
before we go to Greg, I think we'll just pause here and just take some questions.
Yes.
If that's okay, because I think we've covered quite a lot of material. I just had two questions. One was the period for the review, so we would do this again if we...
Yeah, so there's a 3-year requirement to do reviews in the Act. So every 3 years you have to review the policy. As I said, the review can simply be this level of process. So your officers do some analysis of what the policy is doing, reflect on any of the available information and changes, and there's a paper that was produced that goes through all of the kind of detail of that. Have a workshop of this kind of nature, and then I suppose out of this workshop, paper would be taken to the council, perhaps recommending no policy change, but here are some other options or other things that may be considered. So every 3 years.
Okay. Just a second question. I know you said that the cap was about right, but in the earlier slides you'd said that we should be, if we were back on the national average, having about 247.
Yep.
So should we not be trying to get to a cap of somewhere around there to be back in line?
Yes, you should, but the policy won't get you there. So the policy has sort of done as much as it can, and now it's plateaued out. And there really isn't any levers left in the policy that would bring you down to that many machines, particularly over a quick period of time. So the difficulty is that you've done everything you probably pretty much can within the policy, but to get to lower numbers of machines, you're going to have to look to some levers that sit outside this set of policies to try and achieve that. And there may be some ideas we can discuss about options on that. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm sure councillors might be happy to hear some ideas about what other levers, but I'll just see if there's any other questions at this point. So, Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for your report. Very interesting topic. Just have one question on one of your slides. You said an Australian report in August, of 2010, reported that economic activity from gambling does not result in significant benefits. Did they include horse racing in that?
I think it was no. I think it was focused on pokies, on electronic gaming machines. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say Melbourne Cup might be to differ.
Yeah. I think my recollection is it was focused on this industry as opposed to horse racing. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I'm very interested in this, the ability to try and somehow set our target at 40% of all gaming profits coming back into our region rather than the 31%. Can you elaborate as to how we could actually do that within the policy? What levers could we pull?
Yep. So the policy itself can't do that, but you as a council, and this was done around the time of the last review, I think it's time again to have a conversation with each of the trusts that have venues in Rotorua that have gaming machines, and just take to them that message. Look, we're around 31%. We'd like to drive that up to 40% benefit back into our community. What can you do to help us? One option is that one of the trusts is located and is dedicated to Rotorua, and it might be that there's a conversation with that trust about whether it can expand its the number of venues that it has and machines that it has. It might be that there's a discussion with some of the other trusts about whether they might wish to allow that trust to adopt some of those machines, so to shift some of that balance away from those trusts that operate essentially outside the district to the one that operates within. Sorry, JP, were you going to jump in? Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to add, Grant, sorry if I cut you off there at the finish. It's certainly something that we've started to turn our minds to, because we've been here before, and you can see the data goes back and continues to go back in the same format where we're not seeing that funding coming to our community. One of the things that I think we need to shine a light on is I think there's 7 trusts that operate here. One of the things we were talking about outside of the policy is inviting them to come and present annually about what grants they're dispersing to our community. So we put some light into what they are distributing. That gives you the opportunity as representatives of our community to ask what they're doing to encourage it. The other things we talked about is there a need to talk about regular funding summits where we have a lot of community groups that are hurting and not-for-profits. How do we create a situation where they can speed date across a number of trusts and opportunities to seek funding? Again, that would be a challenge to those trusts to come along and provide information and provide that assistance. And then the last option we keen to go back and challenge the trusts on is collectively could they fund a funding navigator who could help community groups fill in applications and pursue funding. So there's a range of things I think need to be put in place to put some more information out there and encourage those trusts to really see the importance to us as a community of returning some of that funding that's taken from our community back into our community. So Grant, didn't mean to cut you off at that point, but I do think this is a really important issue for us, where a lack of knowledge or an inability to hit the criteria is really creating a challenge and a whole bunch of lost money that should be coming to our community.
If I may, Madam Chair, if I recall I used to be associated with this back in the day, the argument that I heard about why that's not the situation that we work in is that they believe that they're drawing from a national pool. If you are only going to be getting a share of the money that's spent in your community, that pool could be smaller, so your share actually could decrease. That was one of the arguments that I had thrown back at me. Is that true?
Well, I think JP's suggestion, and I think this is something that's worthwhile doing anyway, is invite those trusts in to present, and it might be in a workshop situation, and there might be a number of them that present one occasion and a number at another. But you go how to manage that. But I actually think just having a conversation, and you can ask that question. If we drive this too hard, does it mean that we'll actually have less money? But my sort of sense at this point is we had a conversation through the strategy manager about 3 years ago and looked at some of the detail around that. But I think the kind of invitation might be better in terms of where we've come to, might be better coming from you. And look, they'll come with a whole lot of, I imagine, quite positive statements about what they're doing, and you'll need to be ready with the kind of key cutting questions that you might wish to ask them. But I don't think it would harm at all having that conversation, getting a sense of what they're doing, where their funding's going, who is it currently going to, what they see as the barriers. People just not able to fill out the application forms, and that's why the money's not coming back, or is it some other factor? Would they be interested in co-funding a navigator who might facilitate that? Of course, some of you might have a view about actually taking, for groups to be taking this money, and sometimes some groups do kind of go, I really don't want that kind of money because it comes with that sort of issue and the problems that it's associated with it. But in terms of a set of questions in terms of developing a little bit of a relationship with these trusts, they're operating in your area, they are taking quite considerable amounts of money out of your population. Where's that money going to? Could it be more of it be coming back? What benefits are we seeing from that? Some genuinely good questions you could ask. Yeah.
I have one more, Madam Chair. One more, just the last one. The relocations policy, or part of that policy.
I think we're coming to that, aren't we, Greg?
Oh, do you want to?
Sorry, yeah, we will traverse some of this in the next slide or two.
Okay, so we'll just hold that question. So I'll just take a couple of questions here, and then I think we'll just finish this presentation because I'm just mindful of time, and then we'll use the rest of the time for questions. So I think, Councillor, you had a question?
Yes, I did, Madam Chair. Thank you. Was there 6 or 7 venues that you said in Rotorua that had EGMs?
No. Yep.
No? Trusts?
Trusts, yeah.
Oh,
The
okay.
number of trusts. There's a lot more venues. I think it's 23. Yeah.
Ah, right. Okay. Are we able to get a list of those? That would be of interest.
Yeah, there's, sorry, Greg, yeah.
Sorry, there's a report that really fills in a lot of the detail that is in this presentation that we'll upload into Stella for you, which provides the detail that underpins.
Great. Okay. Under the current policy, funny question, but Rotorua's got this nickname of Roto Vegas sometimes along the way. Would it, if a hotel wanted to set up as a casino in Rotorua, is that just not doable under the current policy?
Yeah, no, it's not. So it's actually under the legislation. So New Zealand went through a phase of establishing casinos.
Yep.
And Rotorua did do a bid back 20 years ago. The number of that's now being sort of set, so there are no more casinos under that change in legislation that occurred. So the simple answer is no. No one can set up a new casino in Rotorua, whether you'd like that or not. That's just not possible.
No, that's great. Thank you.
This last question here then to Councillor Brown, and then we'll take the rest of the presentation, then I'll come back to questions. So, Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a question from a recipient's non-profit organisation looking for funding from the Gaming Trust. Is there a source of information easily accessible to find out who the 7 are that are operating in Rotorua that they could apply to?
Yeah, so as Greg said, there's a more fulsome report that outlines exactly who those trusts are and what venues they have. Each of them will have, I'm pretty sure all of them have a website, and certainly all of them have information on where you can obtain funding from and the forms that you need to complete and those sorts of things. But again, if you are of a mind to invite them in, then that would be certainly some questions you could be asking them, and you might want to ask them to bring along information on how people can apply and what the format of the forms are. But yeah.
Well, I would certainly support that if that's something we're thinking about. Thank you.
Okay, Greg, we'll come back to you for the rest of the presentation.
Thank you. Thought we'd just put up a bit of a visual representation of where these venues are across the district. This is showing the actual venues and not the number of pokie machines at each venue, with the red dots being the TAB venues. So as you can see, they're concentrated in the CBD from a venue perspective, not necessarily from a machines perspective, though. The report that will underpin this does have the detail on how many machines each venue has. So just sort of covering off what Grant said about the possible policy responses that we can do. So there's an option to remove the cap of 350 machines and have a sinking lid without a cap. However, that is not really going to have the effect that we want it to have because the current machines are quite a bit higher than what the current cap is. There's also an option to not allow relocations at all. So the effect of including relocations, so if a council allows relocations, it will significantly weaken the sink-in lid policy. obviously seeing the machines moving from one venue to another does not necessarily reduce the number of machines that we have. The Gambling Act allows venues that previously had up to 18 machines to continue operating after the Act. So it also said that any new venue can only have 9 machines, meaning that 18 machine venues which close could only be replaced with 9 machine venues. The Act was changed in 2013, allowing councils to include relocations in their Class 4 venue policies. And a relocations clause allows 18 machine venues, which might have been replaced by 9 machine venues, to be relocated without losing any of the machines. The other opportunities, and this is something that Grant did touch on as well, so we can undertake further analysis from the data set of the grants, which are made in Rotorua, and encourage corporate societies to distribute their 40%. It really becomes an advocacy function or role. Alternatively, we can advocate for the venue owners to operate, that they sign venue agreements with the One Foundation, which is Rotorua based, and is more likely to distribute grant funding back within the district. Sort of outlining again what the next steps will be on this. So we'll consider the options, you will consider the options from this review, and you'll either roll over the current policy or you'll propose amendments to the existing policy. If you propose to amend the policy, we will follow a special consultative procedure. We'll bring forward a statement of proposal similar to what we've done with the dog bylaw recently, and go out for consultation with the community and have hearings and deliberations, and then consider all of that for an adopted new policy or amended policy. So happy to take any further questions.
Okay, I'll come to you, Councillor Patterson. Just in terms of that last bullet point on your slide there about the option to amend the policy. So what's our time frame and process in terms of just getting this through the council committee process? So
I think, following questions today and sort of getting some direction from you whether, you want to go and have a look at amending some of these, we can bring a paper forward within the next sort of month or two, and then from there work out our timeline of whether we're going to consult or not, depending on your decision, and that will probably look into the early part of next year and come back with an amended policy then.
So it has to be adopted by, because we've started the process, so we're okay, but it needs to be adopted by a particular date? No, so we're okay because we've started the review within 3 years.
So this policy does not lapse. The review has to start within 3 years. We can roll over that policy through a council resolution and carry on with the current policy, or we can go out for consultation. So there is no deadline at which we have to consult with the community on this.
Okay, thank you for that, Greg. So I've got Councillor Patterson, then Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just getting back to the relocation question, and it kind of carries on from what Councillor Lee suggested. There's been a rumour going around for years about one of the trusts considering consolidating all of their machines in one spot, not necessarily calling it a casino, but putting it all in one spot. Is that legal with the current framework that we have?
No. Sorry? No, so they can't consolidate all the machines into one venue, basically. Yeah. So there's a limitation around that in terms of the 80 machine limit. So I think I'd probably say you can be reasonably confident that despite that rumour, they would really struggle to kind of take that forward. Yeah.
So that couldn't be done on a national level, going over our heads?
Oh yes, it could be done on a national level, but there'd need to be legislation change.
Okay.
So how would I put this? Yeah. So we have a government that is making changes to a range of policies and a range of legislation, and it is, Parliament is sovereign essentially, subject to some matters around other aspects of the kind of constitution. I'm getting very complicated. Basically,
the answer is no on that one at the moment.
The answer is that Parliament can legislate to make change, but this is certainly not something I've heard on their radar, and they've got a lot to deal with at the moment.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. I've got quite a few other questions, so we'll go Councillor Lee, Waro, and then O'Brien.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Not so much a question, really, but you wanted feedback. I would be delighted to hear from the trustees, I guess they are, of these trusts, and I would think an invitation in the context of public consultation would make a lot of sense, and so that would be the obvious way forward for me. So I would tend to support putting this out for public consultation, if only for that reason, because it is really good to see that money reinvested in Rotorua, and also in relation to putting up a page. I would have thought that would have been something the council could do rather easily, to perhaps somewhere handy on our website, a link on our website to where we provide the community with funding, provide them on the same page with information to the other trusts that do offer funding in Rotorua. There's my two suggestions.
Thank you for that suggestion. Councillor Lee, Councillor Waru.
Tēnā koe te tiamana. Tēnā horua, thank you. Just a question around the, mentioned the deadline, well, the no deadline of the review. Would it not be, and you can fix me up on this if you if you want to, would it not be better for those people in the venues, for those venues, to have some stability in terms of the direction we want to go now, instead of leaving it hanging, or they just operate off what's currently there until we do, if we do, make some decisions? I don't know the impacts on those venues.
So look, the process is that you've got a requirement to review, and you've started that. If your decision is to leave the policy as is, then I think all of the venue operators will appreciate that that's what you've done, because it'll be a council decision. You can communicate it further if you wish to, directly by way of letter or something along those lines. But they'll be well aware that you've made that decision, I expect, and will be comforted that the review is then stopped, and then there won't be another review to the policy for another 3 years. So they'll be operating in a stable environment with the policy as is. Yeah.
So in terms of that, then that's a yes. It would be in our best interest to actually make a decision on this, not right away now, but I mean, we don't want to be leaving it hanging for a year or two to go on.
Well, yeah, so my sense is this workshop is to give you a sense of what the options are, and the option with the review is either to leave the policy as is, or to amend the policy by perhaps introducing a sinking lid, or by having a tightening of the relocations part of the policy. As we've discussed, those options really don't provide you with much more than what your current policy does. So your decision can be at the forthcoming committee meeting to say, we're very happy that the policy remain as is, the review's over, we'll be looking at a review in 3 years' time, but the industry and the community can be satisfied that the policy as is doing as much as it really can. Yeah.
Thank you. And just my last question, and thank you for that answer. It's logical, practical. The other one is, and it might be a little bit, I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this, but in one of the slides, you know, it shows the, I suppose, not the impact, but the increase of funds coming in from various venues around Rotorua. You know, when you're hearing, well, in the circles I certainly walk in, you're hearing a lot of funders saying, oh, it's getting harder. Our budgets are tight this year. We're not, we don't have the funds that we usually would. And then I see that. Are you able to give an explanation as to why, when the funding is actually, well, the take is actually increasing, yet we're constantly told that there's not, the money is not the same as it was in previous years?
Certainly my sense of that there has been a restriction on central government funding. So often the NGOs or the organisations that are working, particularly in the kind of social support environment, but also clubs and sports clubs, receive funding from a variety of sources. So there's often central government funding, particularly for kind of social service support that's available. My sense is this government has restricted that or has stopped a number of that kind of range of funding. So maybe the reflection you're getting back is not that this gambling kind of pokey funding isn't as available, it's that the central government funding has decreased. But if it is about the gambling funding, the answer is no, it hasn't decreased. But it may be that this conversation, which we're kind of alluding to or discussing, of having the trusts come in and explain what funding they're now offering in Rotorua and where that's going and what it's been picked up for, and are there any barriers to community organisations if they wish to accessing that, may also be something that provides some opportunities for more of that funding to come back into Rotorua than it currently does. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Councillor O'Brien.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through the Chair, thank you very much, Doctor. Apologies, sorry, I left my writing pad in our green room, so I made notes on my phone. Could I ask you, please, is there any further pages, sorry, can I ask about the responsibilities of those that hold pokey licences, on what their responsibilities are? Do we have a slide on that today?
No, because it's sort of...
No, that's fine.
No,
that's
no,
cool.
but what I can tell you is that, so for each of the venues, there are a range of policies that operate between the trust and the venue owner and operator. So, for example, if there's a trust that has machines in a tavern, then the tavern owner and operator will have an agreement between the trust and themselves in terms of how they're meant to operate. There's also agreements and arrangements between the Department of Internal Affairs and the Trust about how this is also meant to operate. So there are some kind of, if you like, policies and agreements in place as to what the expectations are of particularly the venue, the tavern owner, and their staff in terms of ensuring that they're trying to identify if they're problem gamblers, they're providing problem gambling information. They're regularly circulating through the venue to make sure people aren't intoxicated or aren't gambling inappropriately or going to the ATM machine to draw out more money than they should be. So there are those sort of requirements that are in place. My sense is they're probably not as well monitored and enforced as might be the case, particularly as the Department of Internal Affairs essentially has gambling monitoring enforcement staff throughout the country. They're not your staff that do that. But again, because there's a crossover with taverns, that might be something that your alcohol inspectors, the medical officer of health, others that currently do work in inspecting alcohol licences and ensuring that they're operating in the same way. I think it's within their ambit to also ask if there's crossovers. That they understand better how they're managing their responsibilities in terms of the sale and supply of alcohol and their responsibilities in terms of gambling. So,
thank you. If I could have a couple of...
Sure.
So could I ask you, so as you say, so with each trust, so if I'm with Trust A and Councillor Wing's with Trust B, his premises, are they fairly standard requirements?
Yep, they're reasonably generic, but again, you can ask, this is all information that's held by the Department of Internal Affairs. So your staff, if you wished, could request all of those documents from the Department of Internal Affairs for each of those trusts and make a comparison for you, just to give you some comfort that they're all in place and generally what they say. Sorry, I'm probably speaking a little bit out of turn, but
no, this is what we're...
Yeah. And those policies are, they have an element of them, or a reasonable element of them, that's designed to try and address the risk of problem gambling.
Okay, so as a subsequent to that, so I was at a place yesterday that has pokies and having lunch there, and there's a money machine right beside the pokies.
Yep.
Now, can I ask, what's your opinion? Is that dangerous, that someone can have access to repeat, or do you think that's a good idea, where it's closer for the staff to be able to monitor someone's movements and withdrawals? Bear in mind that you can't obviously sit behind them and see how much they're taking out, but what do you think?
So from a personal point of view, I think having ATM machines in or adjacent to within the same venue as poker machines does raise a risk. That's my kind of personal view, and I probably wouldn't prefer that as being the right option. But there are a number of venues that do have that, and again, there could be a little bit of analysis of what those venues are, and again, if you're bringing in the trusts, they'll be well aware of the venues they operate. You can certainly ask them those sorts of questions, and you could probably ask them the same question you just asked me. You might get a different answer, but that's the way things work. Yeah.
Thank you. And could I ask TAB machines? So if I go up to the till, person sees me, hammer my money, get my ticket. Normally a losing ticket, but that's by the by. Where there's those TAB machines, where there's no human interaction, is that more of a risk again, that there's no human interaction or monitoring? Because in a busy time, I guarantee no one will be keeping track of who's going up to what machine, especially on an important race day. Is there anything we can do about that, but bearing in mind it's TAB?
Yeah. You don't have control over those operations, those TAB self-serve operations. So my view is that where the biggest risk lies in gambling is with electronic gambling machines, pokies. So TAB self-service operations are definitely lower down the risk level than poker machines, and that's mainly because of the way in which they operate. So you're not having that kind of instant putting in, and gratification. So they're not as addictive. They don't have the bells and whistles and lights and all the other things that actually make poker machines quite addictive. So they're at a lower level of risk. And while you wouldn't want necessarily to have an overabundance of those in venues across Rotorua, my sense is that where your focus should be is actually on the pokies and those venues with those kinds of controls and so on with those. If you've got to kind of go, where do I put my effort? That's certainly where I'd be putting effort, rather than being too concerned about TAB self-service operations.
Thank you. And my final question, could I just ask our staff, so in the report it says advocate under other opportunities, sorry, it didn't see a page number, but it's there, advocate for one license, I take it?
Yeah.
What do we envisage advocate mean? Does that mean we make it a rule, or are we saying we strongly encourage? What does advocate mean as far as what we would do in a policy review?
My kind of sense, because I helped put that slide together as well, my sense was it's more along the lines of probably advocacy might be a little bit of a too strong a word. And
whatever word you're comfortable with,
yeah.
Give me direction about I think it's
encouraging. I think probably one of the outcomes that we might, from the discussion I've heard, be generally comfortable with is inviting the trusts in and asking them questions. And one of the questions you might ask is, One Foundation is based in Rotorua. They will be returning their funding to Rotorua. Wouldn't that be a better option for our community than your trust, which doesn't? Yeah. So that's the kind of level of, I think, encouragement or question or advocacy that I think that slide was intending.
Thank you. And can I ask you, how does, say, a location, if I buy a pub tomorrow with poker machines, do I have to stick with the current trust I'm with, or can I choose which trust?
No, you can move from trust to trust. My expectation on that is that you'd need to, there'd be a time period that would happen, and it wouldn't be a decision that you'd probably make as a trust instantly, but it's something that, you could certainly ask in terms of that first engagement, and then you might have an engagement a year or so later, and, has anything changed? No, it hasn't. Okay. Why hasn't it changed? I don't think you'll get an instant part of that process happening, because there'll be arrangements in place that take some time to, unwind and then wind up with someone else. But I don't think there's any particular harm in you asking the question of, is that possible? How would that work? How long would it take? Those sorts of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do have some other questions, but I think I'll save those for another day. Those were my main ones for today. Thank you.
You're welcome to ask them now if you do want to. No? Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions, councillors, whilst we've got Grant here with us? So if not, it seems like there's, and just trying to get some general direction because this is just a workshop, so we're not making any decisions here. But am I getting a sense that councillors would like to have some kind of workshop where we invite in the trusts to ask them to give us a presentation about the number of grants and who they grant to, whether or not they'd be prepared to fund a funding summit or some kind of navigator, and what else, and other questions we could ask them around how we can ensure distributions are made back to the Rotorua community. Does that?
Could I ask, Madam Chair, how soon would that be? How, like, when's the latest they could respond to that by?
Councillor, I think for us, if we turned around and sort out the right contact address, sent out some letters, we would probably be pitching for something in November to give them some sufficient time for them to report back, probably on the previous financial year.
Maybe if there is that general sense that we should have that, then maybe there's an opportunity for maybe councillors to feed back into JP any other questions, and we can kind of collate all the questions, and then we can make sure that when we're asking the trusts to present, that they're all presenting on the same criteria. So if I take that on as it seems that I'm getting lots of nods around the room, so we're not making a decision, but we'll look at that, and if you want to feed back the questions to JP around that, that would be great. So any final comments or questions? I think otherwise, no. Oh, Your Worship.
Thank you very much, and look, thank you for the work that's gone into this, and obviously the work that you've done yourself. I do just want to note that while we're considering the physical venues, the presence of online gambling, which is very accessible on the phone, continues to be of serious concern for many, and of course it's very hard to confirm whether that person is even old enough to legally gamble. So while we're discussing this, there is a much broader, bigger issue occurring in our community, but do look forward to finding a fair way forward and any changes if necessary.
Okay, I don't think we've got any further questions, so can I thank you very much, Grant and Greg, for the presentation, and thank you, Grant, for coming down to Auckland to make yourself available to answer questions on this. With that then, Councillor Waru, closing karakia, please.
Kia ora tātou. O tira kōrua, tēnā kōrua I tā kōrua reporter. Thank you for the kōrero and giving us the knowledge update, because it's quite a big thing, something for us to really think about how we can get some more interaction, I suppose, with those who give to our community and who are, by the look of it, might be in a position to maybe give a bit more to help us along our journey. So, atu I tērā, kia inui tātou. Kia tātou katoa te ata whai o tō tātou ariki e hukaraiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga ki te wairua tapu, ake, āmi.
Ngā mihi, Councillor Waru. Thank you very much, everyone, and we'll declare the workshop closed. Thank you very much, Grant.
Great, 2:15. Excellent.